beginning. Hello, listeners. In this podcast, we speak with acclaimed researcher on leadership, Dr. David Day. If you're a leader or aspiring to be one, you've probably been bombarded with advice on how to be a good leader. But how do we know which of these advice truly work? In our conversation, Dr. Day helps sort the wheat from the chaff based on the most recent evidence. He also weighs in on fads that claim to draw from the neuroscience of leadership, but with questionable validity, and points to more promising areas that help prepare leaders to operate under increasing uncertainty.
And in particular, charting and understanding personal trajectories of development. That is, personal trajectories of change as a leader over time. But I'm also interested in extending this into more collective forms of leadership around leadership capacity. So developing individuals is one thing, but then developing collective leadership capacity, I think, is really where most organizations want to go. And so it's really very early days in terms of the research around this, but using tools such as social network analysis, I think, offers some really keen insights into developing not only individuals, but this notion of a collective leadership capacity.
That's really fascinating, David. As we move into a world of greater volatility, I think the demands on leadership is just expanding. It's not just one person's capability that's important, but really it's the team's effort that's going to make a difference. So I'm certainly looking forward to hearing more about what you have. I just pulled out this statistic and I wanted to get your opinions. Last year, the Economist Group ran a survey with CEOs from around the world, and they found that 43% of them believe there's insufficient leadership talent to execute on their strategies. What's the real issue here? Are we missing on our ability to grow good leaders, or do we simply not understand leadership effectiveness?
Well, if I had the answer to that one, Shreya, that would be kind of the holy grail of helping organizations master their leadership development challenges. But it's a complex, if not wicked, problem for organizations, because it's dealing with this notion of development. It's dealing with this notion of what some would call more soft kinds of skills rather than technical skills. I think Ron Heifetz talks about adaptive challenges versus technical challenges. And a lot of the leaders who rise through the ranks have been doing so based on their skills to solve technical challenges. And what's really needed at top levels are people who can not only engage in helping to solve adaptive challenges, but engage with others to do so. So this notion of, is having an insufficient leadership talent, I think it's due to many possible factors, one of which being this focus on technical versus adaptive challenges. But another one is in terms of not looking broadly enough for leadership potential within an organization. I think it was John Gardner who said that most people go through their lives using only a small fraction of their potential. And one of these potentials is leadership potential. So why is it that some people have never led or never considered leading? These are untapped resources that exist in every organization. So helping to facilitate that potential and to amplify or grow that potential is really, I think, would help go a long way towards addressing this leadership crisis.
That's interesting, David. So you said it's a question of identifying leadership talent. So let's go back to the age-old question. Can everybody be a leader?
I think so. Everybody can be a leader, but everybody cannot be the leader, if you get my drift, right? And I think I get frustrated with people say, well, if everybody's a leader, then who's going to follow? Too many cooks spoil the broth kind of thing. And that, I think, misses the point massively, because leadership is not a position, it's a process, and it's a dynamic process that can involve a wide array of individuals. And so while somebody may be the leader at a particular point of time. Someone else around the table could be the leader just a few moments later, depending on who's exercising social influence, who's providing expertise, and so forth and so on. So I think everyone can be developed to be a more effective leader, and we need more effective leaders at all levels of organizations. Now, it doesn't mean everybody's going to be the CEO. It just means that people should embrace this responsibility to engage in leadership when it's needed.
So where should organizations be placing their effort? Is it to grow just a few high potentials, grow leaders across the board?
That's an excellent question. I think most organizations take this high potential leadership approach, which has some underlying assumptions to it, which is that leadership is somewhat of an exclusive process that only some people have a right to participate in. I mean, that may not be the message that comes across explicitly, but I think implicitly, when you have a high potential kind of focus with your development, that is the implicit message, that leadership is not for everybody. It's for only those special chosen ones. And I think that's an unfortunate message. Having said that, I realize that resources are tight in organizations, and trying to invest in everybody's potential may not be possible given limited resources. So I think there's ways we need to rethink how we do development, and one of them is to look at it as more of a 24/7 ongoing process rather than an investment in different experiences or programs or so forth.
That's a really great idea, David, a 24/7 ongoing process. Now, I know that some of my counterparts in organizations are just going to flip here that they're already stretched to the brim trying to grow their high potentials, and you're saying make it 24/7. So tell us more.
Well, I think, the technology is changing so quickly that there are resources that are now available that weren't available even just a few years ago, in terms of being able to have ongoing feedback, for example, and ongoing assessments that don't require taking people away from their work in order to develop. It's using their work and their experience to accelerate their development. So leveraging this technology, I think, is one way to do this. And another way is to embrace this more fully. I think it has to be something that transcends an HR department. If development is only the purveyance of HR, it's never really going to be fully embraced in organizations. So we've got to somehow get the message across to line managers to support this 24/7 notion of leadership development.
That's really interesting. And it also converges with what a lot of senior leaders are saying about leadership development. I was just reading this interview in the McKinsey Quarterly about growing leaders in India, which is a topic very dear to my heart, given the huge potential there. And that's what they're talking about, that leadership development cannot be just HR's responsibility. But they also said something interesting, which is throw them on the deep end and see who can swim. Is that a good strategy?
Only if you want to invest in surf and life rescue, I think. This raises an excellent point, and it's tied into some fairly recent research. An article by DeRue and Wellman in 2009 in the Journal of Applied Psychology. It's one of the first articles I accepted as an associate editor at JAP that was looking at developmental challenges. And the thinking of the researchers was that, are there challenges that are too extreme? Is it almost this kind of inverted U kind of shape that if the challenge becomes too much of a stretch assignment, it actually does more harm than it does good? And whereas they didn't find an inverted U, they did find the kind of plateau of return on investment for a developmental challenge once it got to be too high, except if the person had readily available access to feedback. And if they had access to feedback, then that challenge didn't plateau. It continued to help with their development. So just throwing people off the deep end without support mechanisms, I think is just a horrible idea. And it really is putting people in over their heads. And it's a way that makes people frustrated and almost a learned helplessness in terms of leadership development. But the good news is, if we can build in high quality support, then even really extreme challenges, the throwing people into the deep end may actually help with development, as long as there is a life preserver to be thrown to them.
And that's really interesting. So going back to our original question, can everybody be leaders? So my question to you again is, can everyone overcome the plateau should they get access to feedback, or are they individual differences?
Well, I'm a firm believer in individual differences. And I think that there are some people who, by virtue of what they were given through genetics and other things, are just better suited to be leaders and probably don't need as much investment in their development to really thrive as developing leaders. So those people and what those particular potentialities are is still a bit of a question. But the certain people, I think, are more likely to thrive under extreme challenges than others, for sure. But helping others who struggle, one route may be in terms of introducing more support mechanisms, and feedback is one of those.
So let's talk about feedback. What kind of feedback is most beneficial? Is it specific to the task at hand? Is it about the strategy and who they are as individuals? What's the research saying?
Well, the research is saying is that not all feedback is created equally, and that as much as a third of feedback programs or feedback interventions have the opposite effect of what they intend. That is, they have a harmful effect on performance and development. So there are better ways of providing feedback, and having it presented in a more objective and timely fashion is one way to do this. I'm a big fan of what the Center for Creative Leadership uses in their programs around what they call an SBI model of feedback, which stands for Situation, Behavior, Impact. It's a way of helping to make feedback more personal, more objective, and to lower the defensiveness of the recipient of that feedback. So you talk about a situation in which you were in with somebody, the behavior that this person engaged in, and the impact of that behavior on you, not the organization as a whole, not everybody in the universe. What was the impact on you? And when you frame it that way, people are less likely to become defensive about it, because they can't disavow the impact it had on you. They might disavow the impact that it had on third-party people, but they can't disavow the impact it had on you. So learning to do this is pretty easy, but implementing it on a daily basis, it proves to be a bit more difficult. We just struggle with providing good quality feedback to people, and as a result, we're cheating people of their learning. So another piece of this in terms of feedback, one of the seems to be natural reactions when people talk about feedback and can I give you some feedback, it's like, oh no, it's going to be negative. Mm-hmm. Oh no, it's going to be critical. An important point, I think, is that we miss the opportunities to provide positive feedback to people. And the positive feedback is really a way of reinforcing what's being done right. And just basic reinforcement principles, learning principles, would suggest that reinforcing positive behavior through positive feedback is a way of getting people to repeat that. But again, we seem to be very reluctant to do that, perhaps because we think that people will then slack off or they'll start taking advantage of us. But the research doesn't support that at all. It actually supports the point that if you give people positive feedback, they will tend to repeat the behavior that was reinforced.
That's interesting, David. And some of my clients ask, is that culturally, is that universal? Are there cultural differences? Do you have any information on that?
Well, sure. I think that we know a bit about cultural norms, and one of the norms that's very important in certain cultures, and Asian cultures is one of them, is this notion of power distance.
Mm-hmm.
And so providing feedback to someone who is in a position above oneself probably would not be well received in certain cultures unless there was a culture of feedback within the organization, even if this organization is situated in a cultural context where high power distance is the norm.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. Certainly that could take up an entire podcast, so we need to have you back, David.
You're listening to the Exponential Talent Podcast on developing leaders. Our guest today is Dr. David Day.
The things that are predictive of leadership effectiveness, and by the way, let me just go on a bit of a tangent here about effectiveness, because effectiveness is a pretty big construct. What is effectiveness? And I think we tend to think of it more in terms of an outcome, the performance of an individual or the performance of an organization. But I think effectiveness also incorporates process issues that we tend to overlook. So in terms of leadership effectiveness, it may not be just the outcome of that leadership that results in certain performance changes. It's the process by which those changes occur, and we need to focus more on those process kinds of issues. So having said that, what are the kinds of things that predict leadership effectiveness, leadership performance? And I think it comes back to what do we know about individual differences, and what can we measure well? And I think the answers to that are cognitive ability and also personality. So we know from the research that those two things are highly related to leadership emergence and to some extent leadership effectiveness, which are two different things, by the way. There are no doubt many other potential constructs out there that can predict leadership effectiveness, but we need to figure out how to measure them more appropriately. And so some of the work that Dr. Matt Barney had been doing at Infosys and now doing as part of his company at LeaderAmp is using rash measurement modeling to look at some of these other constructs and to measure them very rigorously. And I'm really optimistic that this is going to open a treasure chest of other individual difference measures that can predict leadership effectiveness.
Well, that's wonderful, David. And I know Matt and you have been talking a lot about those measures. Can you give us some insights on what types of things you're looking at?
Well, one of the things that I've been working on in conjunction with a PhD student here at the University of Western Australia is this construct of developmental readiness. Is somebody ready to take on a developmental challenge? We tend to assume that everybody is, or based on other kinds of more subjective, squishy kinds of assessments, we assume, okay, well, this person is ready to take on perhaps a global assignment somewhere. Well, those are pretty big stretch assignments. If we had some measures that could assess the readiness of an individual to take on a developmental stretch assignment, I think that could help maximize the potential in that assignment for leadership development.
It's very interesting and then also very, very practical and relevant. I want to go back again to something else you said earlier, the difference between leadership emergence and leadership effectiveness.
Right.
I know that in the business world, there's a lot of focus on leadership effectiveness, and there's an assumption that people know how to pick leaders. Is leadership emergence about who has the potential to become a leader?
Well, I think it's leadership emergence goes to this notion of perceptions. Who is seen as a leader in a particular context? And some may say, well, that's really not what we're interested in. We're really interested in who's going to be effective. I think that those two things are not the same thing, but they do interrelate. And here's how. If you are seen as a leader, you are much more likely to be able to influence someone than if you're not seen as a leader. And if social influence is a core to leadership, as many approaches would argue, then being seen as a leader makes it easier or facilitates being effective as a leader. If you're not seen as a leader, you may still be effective, but it's going to be more difficult.
Mm-hmm. I think that has huge implications for people who are ambitious and want to be leaders. Do you have any guidance, particularly for women who tend to hit the glass ceiling much earlier in their careers? What can they do to be seen as leaders?
Boy, I wish I had the answer to that, because it's a problem that I think crosses pretty much all cultures, and it's one that's on the forefront of dialogue here in Australia about the role of women in leadership kinds of positions, and in particular women in board positions. We know we can point to examples of very successful women in leadership roles. The CEO of Westpac here in Australia is a woman, and she's been phenomenally successful in that job. And she originally came up through the HR function. So this is very much, an anomaly in terms of a CEO career path, but it just goes to show that there are potentials for senior level leaders in all functions in organizations. So, being seen as a leader is partly how you put yourself forward. And if you don't put yourself forward, you're less likely to be seen as a leader. Now, I'm not sure this is exactly the same as, the lean in phenomenon that's been discussed by Sheryl Sandberg, but it certainly relates to this notion that if you don't put yourself forward, you're never going to be seen as a leader. And there are a lot of men who don't put themselves forward either because of an introverted personality, for example. So learning to embrace that stretch assignment of getting your ideas out, putting yourself forward, is more likely to enhance a perception of leadership than sitting back and hoping to be recognized for your potential.
What about organizations proactively seeking out people who have potential? Because it would be great if everyone who had an interest in leadership raised their hand and got picked. And sometimes too many people raise their hands. So there's still a need to be able to pick the ones with the most potential, on whom the development investments are going to pay off the greatest. What are your thoughts about doing that effectively?
We don't know how to measure leadership potential well. That's the answer. And the way it's typically implemented in organizations is through, say, talent reviews, where people will sit around a table and talk about various executives in terms of their performance and their potential. Now, you have objective information about their performance in terms of, especially if they're running a profit and loss business, in terms of how well they're doing in that particular business. But when it comes down to potential, it comes down to people's subjective opinion about that person's potential. We need to do better, and I think we can do better. And it's sorely needed in organizations of all kinds. How do we objectively measure leadership talent?
What about,
leadership potential.
What about mechanisms like using assessment centers, putting people through a day in a life of their target role? Do you think those types of things are predictive?
I think assessment centers, we know from the research that they're one of the most highly valid predictors of job performance that's out there. Can they be used to predict leadership potential? Perhaps if the assessment center can somehow simulate adaptive challenges. And those tend to be more difficult to do than technical challenges. Not saying that it's impossible, but it requires a different approach of putting people into situations that require leadership. And that's something that needs to be simulated in a high fidelity kind of fashion.
Mm-hmm. You used a very important term here, adaptive challenges. Define that for us.
Yeah. So the adaptive challenges are really things that there is no known solution for. So you have to basically learn your way out of a particular challenge and adapt to whatever the presenting contextual factors are. And this differs from this notion of technical challenges, which I talked about earlier, which are things that we know what the solution is. It's more of a training approach of providing proven solutions to known problems. And so, for example, a lot of engineering problems are technical challenges because it requires and can have an engineering solution to it. But the adaptive challenges tend to reside with people, and those are not solved through engineering kinds of approaches. And I have to share with you one of my favorite quotes from Kurt Vonnegut in Slaughterhouse-Five. He said, "If it weren't for the people always getting caught up in the machinery, Earth would be an engineer's paradise." So I firmly believe that, and I think this is one of the reasons why engineers and accountants keep the leadership development industry in business, because they get to a certain point in their career through mastering these technical challenges and then find themselves at a career crossroad where that's not needed anymore. What's needed is for them to engage with adaptive challenges.
Very, very interesting. And certainly I don't hear that talked about a lot in the industry, and I think it's something we need to pay more attention to. Do you see any organizations doing a good job with addressing adaptive challenges?
That's an interesting question. I think I'm struggling here because you would need to have a much closer perspective on people in their day-to-day kinds of positions rather than looking at what's happening at the organization level as a whole. So the answer is, I don't know who's doing a good job of developing people to address adaptive challenges. And I'm not sure that most leadership development approaches take that perspective.
Mm-hmm. That's very interesting. So on that note, I'm going to ask you one final question. And this is from my clients. You know, there's a growing market on the neurological basis of leadership, and there are several who claim that they use the science on the brain science to grow better leaders. What are your thoughts on this area?
Well, do we have another hour? I think
5 sentences or less.
Thanks, Shreya. I think the leadership and leadership development field has been plagued with fads, and I think this is another indicator of that unfortunate trend. Here's why. Even if we were able to map the brain in terms of what lights up when someone, for example, is exposed to a transformational leader, using fMRI or other kinds of brain imaging technology, what would we do with that information? Also, what if we could image the brains of highly effective leaders? Would that give us any information about developing other kinds of leaders? My answer is it might be very interesting from a more descriptive kind of approach, but it's not very helpful in terms of what we do to prepare others for these adaptive leadership challenges. So I think it's an unfortunate trend or an unfortunate fad that has turned the heads of a number of people, not just in the leadership development space, but in science in general, around this notion of mapping or imaging brains and coming to some insight about human behavior.
Excellent. Well, David, you definitely passed the challenge. 5 sentences or less. And that's, by the way, that's extremely informative because, again, around the world, we're seeing this industry to be growing. And I know several of my clients have asked me about the validity of these claims that you can really develop leaders better by understanding how the brain functions. So I'm sorry that we've run out of time, but I know there is so much more to talk about. I think our leaders will find your comments on leader emergence and leadership effectiveness to be very, very valuable, as well as the idea of adaptive challenges. And I think we need to have another session where you can come back and give us more ideas and the more recent findings from research. So until then, thank you so much for coming to our show. This has been tremendously valuable, and I know our readers are going to agree, so thank you again.
Thank you, Shreya, and I look forward to being invited back to carry on the discussion.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much.
There you have it, listeners. That was our Exponential Talent podcast on developing leaders with Dr. David Day. Many nuggets of insights here. What stood out for me was that throwing leaders into the deep end and hoping they learn to swim is not the best leadership development advice. As Dr. Day mentions, if you're going to put your new leaders in challenging situations, please do support them with a life vest. Studies show that there are two things that are key for a new leader. One is learning from mistakes, and the second is gaining confidence through early wins. When a new leader is set loose on a difficult project, the chances of failure are high. There's also no guarantee that they will learn from this challenging experience. This is why experts recommend supporting new leaders with a coach or a mentor. Such a support structure helps them proactively strategize before they even get started. It also helps them actively reflect on the experience, which they may not do on their own, and these together maximizes their learning. So that brings us to the end of the podcast. If you enjoyed this conversation, please don't forget to subscribe. Until the next time, goodbye from your host, Shreya Sarkardani.